My name is Marcia Robinson, and we are recording an oral history with Mr. Rod Nimtz as part of the Sweet MUMories Oral History Project to mark the 50th anniversary of the Miami University Middletown, Ohio campus. This interview is taking place on July 8th at the Voice of America location. Mr. Nimtz, do I have your consent to proceed with this interview?
Certainly.
Thank you. Would you please tell us about your time before coming to Miami University?
I grew up born in Cleveland, lived in Cleveland, born in the Youngstown area, most of my life, 1967 to 77 in Cincinnati, specifically in the Green Hills area. Graduated Green Hills High School in 77, and then came to Miami as a freshman, moved into Collins Hall August the 21st, 1977. Started classes, in those days we started on Wednesdays, so on the 24th was my first day of class.
Okay.
And still actually have connections with two of my original professors from that first day are still at Oxford. We're still stays in touch. One is, my first class was Dr. David Fahey in history for Western Civ. And then later that morning I had Spanish with Dr. Betty Rogers, who continues to be a very good and close friend. And so I was at Oxford, so I started there in 77, got my bachelor's in May of 79, and my master's in May of 81. Yeah, my undergraduate was political science and history with the equivalent of a minor in music, though we didn't have minors in those days. Then my master's in history, and then worked on my PhD, got to the ABD phase, was working on a dissertation. Had been a teaching fellow, so I taught Western Civ while doing that in Oxford. And then in the fall of 1984, Dr. Bob Gelwick of the history faculty at Middletown campus had surgery and needed to have a replacement for a semester. So Dr. Dick Jellison, who was the department chair, sent my name over to the Middletown campus, and I went there in the fall of 84 for one semester as a visiting faculty member while Dr. Gelwick recuperated. For some reason, they liked me. I had a chance to work then with Ray Fenning, who was the coordinator for social sciences, also with Jim Lehman, who was one of the senior history faculty, one of the original faculty on the campus. And so they kept me on for a second semester, 3/4 time teaching and 1/4 time working with Mary Lou Flynn in the admissions office. And I was in the middle of a summertime teaching when I was approached by Dr. Gene Bennett, who was the original executive director of the Middletown campus, to become the half-time assistant to the executive director. So my administrative career began in the, I guess 1985. Started part-time. And over the years, I was the assistant to the executive director. I worked 1 year with Gene. And then in 1986, had worked for 19 years with Dr. Mike Governanti. And let's see, while I was working with Mike, I was the assistant to the executive director. Then I became the assistant executive director. Then I became the assistant director of I became the senior director of administration. And during that time, I was also serving as the Artisan Lecture Series coordinator. And then I was, for a year after that, the interim director of development for Middletown campus. And then in 2008, was appointed director of the Voice of America Learning Center. So that's sort of the career in a nutshell type of thing.
I'd like to talk some more about the humanities in both your education, but also how you maintained your connection to music over the years.
I had the great good fortune of having music always as an avocation. I was doing church music since I was 10. And when I got to Miami, I was able to join the jazz ensembles under Professor Jim Alcott and Bill Alden. But probably my longest-term association was with Dr. John Wabrick in the Miami University Men's Glee Club. I served as an accompanist for them for 12 years, tour directed for 2 years. Fantastic opportunities working with the theater department. Played for 11 of their productions as a rehearsal accompanist and in the pit orchestra. Wrote one of the musicals, a contemporary or a 60s rock setting of Midsummer Night's Dream, where the fairies were played as 60s flower children and the lovers were played as preppies. Directed by Dr. Tom Manning. We did that back in 1981. Okay. So having those kind of connections, and I played for the orchestra, and I also began playing for a lot of the university events I was playing for receptions, parties. I would go to Lewis Place, the president's house, after football games when Dr. Shriver was president. They always had a group of people back to the house, and I would play for those receptions. I played for alumni events. I think I did alumni weekend for 30 years. I was engaged in doing various either special performances and entertainments, or playing for the dinners and the company and things like that. So great. I played for the Miss Miami pageant when it was still extant over at the old Shriver Center in the Heritage Room. In fact, one of those participants actually went on to join the Rockettes up in New York City, Tracy Dodrell. But the opportunity to engage with the theater and with music, history being my major, political science also my major, taking the Spanish, the breadth of opportunities that we had living and working in Oxford. And then when I came to the Middletown campus, beginning in 1987, I became the coordinator for the Artisan Lecture Series.
Before we go there, I'd like to talk about music and global opportunities. So I understand that one of your compositions will receive global attention. Could you talk about that?
In 1984, I was commissioned to write a piece for the Oxford Choral Peace Festival in memory of a gentleman by the name of Eldon Hill. And the piece was called The Questions Asked. It's for an adult choir and either child soloist and children's choir. So it was premiered then, and then I had the good fortune of having it picked up and published by Mark Foster Music. It then made it into the library of the Manchester College, where the choir picked it up and did it for several seasons. I learned after the fact. And in one of their tours, though they were touring in Italy, it was sung at the Basilica at Assisi, which was the home basilica of St. Francis, which has very special meaning because the piece ends with a quote. It references the prayer of St. Francis, being instruments of peace. And then they also performed it at the Vatican. So it was quite an honor to read about that.
Where is this Manchester campus?
Manchester College is up in northeastern Indiana.
Okay, thank you. With that kind of theatrical background and a history major, it sounds like you understand the importance of the humanities and the arts to shaping political thought. That seems to have contributed to your work with the Artisan Lecture Series and also with the Casper Series. Would you mind talking about how that began?
At the point that Claire Easton was moving towards her retirement, and knowing my background in the arts, Dr. Governati had asked me to become the coordinator for the Artisan Lecture Series, which if you look at the history, right from the beginning of the campus, 1966, Claire was hired in October of that year. Almost immediately, they began bringing in performing artists. This is before the Finkelman Auditorium even existed. They used one of the larger classrooms. It was then room 113 in Johnston Hall. It is now a part of the campus community center, that same bit of geography there in the main hallway of Johnston. And of course, once Finkelman opened in September of '69, it made a lot more things possible. It brought in, for example, Vincent Price, Leonard Nimoy, Dizzy Gillespie, Woody Herman and the Thundering Herd, Mercedes McCambridge, and some very major performers, William Wyndham as James Thurber. And then also, at one point in time through the popular concert series, Aerosmith for $1. This is just about the time that Aerosmith's first album had hit. So I'm not sure that Stephen Tyler would remember that performance, but there are several in Middletown that do. The opportunities I had in working with the Artisan Lecture Series were primarily because it was a varied series. It encompassed music, dance, theater. But in the Middletown setting, Middletown is a very arts-rich community. It has a long-standing symphony that Valda Wilkerson created in the 1940s. It has a visual arts center that now it's called Middletown Arts Center. It was then known as Arts in Middletown that was established in the 70s and had a building downtown. There was a local community theater which actually began on the campus as the Campus Community Players, and then when it's in its own direction performing elsewhere. So it was developing non-duplicative programming in that very rich arts milieu, but also trying where possible to tie it to opportunities for music classes, for history classes, anthropology classes. In my second year, I remember working with two anthropologists, Dr. Greenberg and Dr. Esper. They were so excited. We got the amazing Randy to come and to speak, which was a phenomenal experience because, of course, he was at that point exposing all the fakers and the Peter Popoffs and the Uri Gellers. This is when he was really. It was just after he came off tour with Alice Cooper, so there's some fascinating stories we got over dinner about Randy touring with Cooper. My first year, we brought in famous Amos of chocolate chip cookie fame, who, one of the first things he said, would you like to have the recipe? And I looked at him, I thought, oh my God. Well, the cookie recipe for famous Amos chocolate chip cookies is on the back of the chocolate chip cookie bag. He said he made, whoever the lady who was invented chocolate chip cookies, he never changed the recipe, but he changed how it was presented. So it became, because he started literally in the mailroom at the William Morris Agency, but they became famous Amos chocolate chip cookies. He spent 2 days on the campus, had some great opportunities. We brought in a lot of students. He did some motivational speaking. We even had boxes of chocolate chip cookies that were delivered to us. So great opportunities there. Gene Redpath, who was with Prairie Home, sang on Prairie Home Companion for many, many years. One of the champions of Scottish music, had her there twice. Dance groups of the Ballet Gran Folklorico de Mexico, always almost sold out the house.
Could you do that slower for a transcriber?
The Ballet Gran Folklorico de Mexico.
Thank you.
I was showing off my Spanish class. I could still pop that one off. It's making Dr. Rogers proud. We had some theater production. We had Amadeus. We brought in the national players doing Shakespeare pieces. We had some Broadway musicals, what they call bus and truck shows. They were the one-night stand types of things, so they were a little bit scaled back. Ain't Misbehavin' was one of the favorites that always packed the house. This is also at a time that also the local YMCA had a travelogue series that was also held in the Dave Finkel Auditorium on Tuesday nights. So you had the symphony, you had the community theater, you had the visual arts down at the Arts Center, you had the travelogue series from the YMCA, and then you had our programming as well. And we're trying to schedule that around what's happening at the Hamilton campus and the Oxford campus. So it was a fascinating schedule-wise, but also finding ways to provide the opportunities to the community and to the students that they could experience something that they would not normally have the opportunity. Now, bear in mind, these are the days before the Aronoff Center was built in Cincinnati and before Schuster Center in Dayton. So the biggest venue for a performance like this may have been the Taft in Cincinnati or Music Hall. And in Dayton, maybe the Victoria Theater, which was at that point still making a rise as a historical theater and presentation. Oh, and I should mention Middletown even had an opera company for a while, the Sorg Opera Company, which they shared with the city of Richmond. In Richmond, it was known as the Whitewater Opera Company. In Middletown, it was the Sorg Opera Company. They came to town probably around 1990-91. So Middletown had this rich arts, plus what was going on at the local high school. And so finding some unique things. And then later on in a series, we actually started something that was a little bit different. Called the Fantastic Free Fridays. There was a group in town called Artist in Residence. And what they would do is to bring in a single artist for a 2 to 3 week residency and try to take them from school to school to school. Very complex scheduling, very complex if you have to move a lot of equipment. And we're talking, major pianists or cellists like Lauren Hollander, some people of this caliber. What we decided was it might be easier, because that group for a couple of years hadn't brought somebody in. We thought, we've got a theater. We had just got done replacing the lighting system. We just got done replacing the sound system. So we had the stage. We had the equipment. We had, at that point, a 749-seat house. What if the schools brought the students to the theater and we provided the artist? It would be essentially the same kind of relationship, the opportunity for school children who might not have the opportunity to experience a live arts performance, to give them that opportunity. And so we began it in 2000. And it is still continuing. I did it until I stopped handling the artist series, and then Susan Joyce, now retired from our music faculty, shepherded for many years. And now music faculty member at Middletown, Sean Fenton, has just completed his first season. And we're very fortunate that the Bever Family Foundation provides some very generous underwriting for this. But the end result has been that we draw students from Cincinnati, Dayton, Lebanon, Middletown, obviously, a growing population of homeschooled children that don't have structured arts programs, not necessarily. And so they do 3 to 4 performances per semester, just as we did back in 2000. So that's part of the history. We had some fascinating people. Anthony Zerbe and Roscoe Lee Brown did a poetry in motion presentation. Zerbe usually played villains on TV. He was one of the villains in one of the Bond movies. Fascinating man. Roscoe Lee Brown, I believe, was Bahamian, a very powerful speaker. And I learned never to alter an artist's biography. I added a few things, like he'd appeared in All in the Family. And I got chewed out by Roscoe Lee Brown at the reception afterwards. Basically, who wrote that program? So, Rod did. Young man. I very carefully wrote that. It was to be produced as, nobody had told me I couldn't change it. But the performance that they did, and it was nothing but an afternoon of poetry of different contemporary poets, was fascinating. And just the spoken word was just something that was just hard to believe. Well, the first one I ever had was the Butch Thompson Trio from Prairie Home Companion. And so I was thinking, with Garrison Keillor just retiring, back in the day, Butch Thompson was the house band. And I remember they pulled up in a van. We got there to the auditorium early. It was just the 3 guys. It was Vince Giordano was playing bass and baritone sax, Hal Smith playing drums, and then who did I say? Butch Thompson. I can't believe I blanked out on that. Was the pianist. But I remember shaking his hand, and his fingers easily extended 2 inches beyond the end of my hand. It's just huge. But he was playing a lot of stride piano, a lot of ragtime piano, and so ideally fitted. But some marvelous afternoons. We later on took some of our programs and we did some programming down at the Manchester Inn. Usually a winter program, we would combine it with a dinner performance type of a thing. We brought in a street band from New Orleans. So at one point they would do the whole second line routine, then the traditional. And I can remember I had to pay the airfares. And so here's the banjo player, here's the tuba player, here's the trombone player, here's the guy with the umbrella. Why am I bringing a guy with an umbrella from New Orleans? He had to be there. It was part of to create that whole, and the performances were great. We also came up with something called the Southwest Ohio Jazz All-Stars. There were several people in the area who were listed literally in Leonard Feather's Who's Who in Jazz. I think of Norris Turney from Dayton, alto saxophonist. Gene Mayle, who's a bass player. John Von Olen, still with the Blue Wisp Big Band, used to play with Marty Page and his dectet and backed up Mel Torme and led his own big bands. And these guys and Cal Collins on a guitar. These guys are all local, and I played different gigs with them. I called up one time and said, can we put this together? And they looked at the calendar, worked out beautifully. Here's the fun part. No rehearsal. These guys literally would get together, and they knew all the standards. So what to do? You don't play St. Thomas? Good. Let's do Satin Doll. Let's do whatever it was. And each take turns doing their solos. And so they just basically counted off, and boom. So we did a couple of those at Finkelman, then we did some more down at the Manchester Inn. Absolute blast to do. And then, except for one night, the piano player we had, John Burkaw, who taught jazz history for us for many years. John was going to be a little bit late getting there, so I had to cover the first 2 songs. So you open with Satin Doll. Key is C, I'm fine with that. I was a history major, don't throw me any musical curves. We're into this thing, so I do my thing, and Norris does his thing, and I think Gene Mayle was playing bass. In the middle of this, all of a sudden, Norris walks over to me and says, take it up a half a step. And that puts you into C sharp or D flat. I had never played Satin Doll in anything other than the key of C. I learned real fast. It's just so some of those fun experiences you get to do with them. We also had, not part of the series, Jerry Reed and his band came in. We had a fantastic routing opening opportunity came to us. And so Jerry Reed and his group was there one night. Then I got a phone call from Helen Reddy. I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar. She had a date up in Akron at E.J. Thomas Hall. And she was looking for a date the night before to fill in. So we did the show with her. And then we were going out to dinner afterwards to a local restaurant called Capozzi's down on Central, which is where the coffee shop is now. And they held the kitchen open for us. And walking in there and surprising the lady who was the hostess, she said, "That's Helen Reddy." I said, "Yes." And it's just some fun times like that. The other aspect of my work with the Artisan Lecture Series was doing the Casper lectures. I had, again, inherited that responsibility from Claire. Had the opportunity to work with Brandy Casper, Arthur Brandeis Casper, who is still very active with the series, his brother Robert, and their mother, the late Dolly Casper. Working with Dolly Casper was a real delight. Dolly was an old school type of person, very precise, and she had a group of ladies that volunteered with her for the post-speech receptions. And they would have the cookies and punch and that sort of a thing. Well, over time, as those groups got a bit older, and just because we were doing the logistics, I offered to take on that responsibility. And just not only meeting some of these people, I remember picking up, driving down to Cincinnati Airport to get Edmund Muskie. And I'm walking down the concourse, and Muskie's plane had gotten early. So Muskie is walking towards me, and he's got this rather tall, white-haired gentleman with him, Tip O'Neill. So they're in the middle of the airport. You're going to spend 2 days with Muskie, but with the bonus of meeting the Speaker of the House. So having the opportunity to meet not only Muskie, who was the Speaker, but also Tip O'Neill was just a real benefit. Had some fascinating times. Oscar Arias, who received the Nobel Peace Prize, former president of Costa Rica, was in for 2 days. We always would try to arrange some student time with a political science or a history class in addition to the public presentation. And I can remember going shopping because he needed some toiletries and so we went over to the drugstore there on Brielle Boulevard, and I happened to need some razor blades. I don't know why I crossed my mind, but I thought, here, I'll just pick it up. So he's going through the line in front of me, and I'm behind him. And he says, I remember he looked at me and said, "What are you getting?" I said, "I'm just to get some razor blades." He said, "Here, I had a Nobel Peace Prize laureate buy me razor blades." Who would have thought, back years ago, those kinds of experiences. Mm-hmm. But the Casper lectures, we had Benjamin Hook, who was at that point the retired president of the NAACP, had him in for 2 days, had him with classes. We hosted a special lunch on the stage. We had a challenge. We had Sarah Brady, at a time, very, very hot issues, and still is today. We had protesters outside. And when she came out to speak, they stood up and turned around and catcalled. And we had actually one of the protesters die at the auditorium. In the middle of all this, he suffered a heart attack. So I remember looking out from behind stage, and I thought it was just somebody who was making a strain. And I see the local plainclothes police carrying this gentleman out into the hallway. So I ducked around backstage, and sure enough, they had him on his back. They were doing the CPR. They called the ambulance. Very sadly, he passed away that night. But that was probably one of we were backstage before, and she was used to having protesters at her speeches. And the gentleman I had from the Miami's Police Department was Detective John Barnhart. And John had been with the NSA and had worked in the D.C. area. So they're literally backstage comparing notes on jazz clubs in D.C. It was a nice way to kind of keep her calm down before going out there. That was probably the strangest, most challenging night that we had. But working with Dolly, one of my favorite stories of Dolly, and I've told this to her sons, we got through this. I forget who the speaker was, but I had made the arrangements with the caterer, had everything all set up, and we had tablecloths, and I had some candelabras, and we always made sure we had some flowers for Mrs. Casper. And we took the pictures afterwards, and she was very complimentary. The next day, she called me in the office and was very upset with me because she felt that the reception was not up to snuff. It didn't look right. The cookies should be on doilies, and the doilies on trays, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I was relatively new in the position, and I was a little bit panicked. I called the president's office, because the president's always there, and I talked to Jane Sheard, who was the secretary, just let her know this Mrs. Casper had been upset. And she said, well, it's okay, we hadn't heard anything, but you did the right thing by agreeing to fix it. And so come the next year, I was responsible for the reception again. Had the tablecloths, had the trays, had the doilies, everything was all laid out. I had the university photographer take pictures of me, lighting the candelabras backstage. Had an 11 by 14 picture made. I sent it to President Pearson for my file, just in case this comes up again. But Mrs. Casper and I remember Fusako Gelwick, Bob Gelwick's wife, used to help out, and Claire Easton with the receptions afterwards. So when we took that over, I think it made it a little bit easier for them in some respects. But of course, the standards for me there was an area I'd not dealt with, which was fascinating. The opportunities in Middletown, one time, Senator Barry Levy, for whom Levy Hall is named, at that point, he was one of the owners of the Manchester. He, Perry Thatcher, and Bill Akers had bought the Manchester, and after AK Steel had closed it down. But Barry was also then named a consul for Luxembourg. And the Prince of Luxembourg came to visit. And John Mueller, who was the general manager of the hotel, gave me a call and said, the Senator and Mrs. Levy would like you to provide the music. I literally sat and played without stopping for 4 hours. And it was a very formal, royalty for that matter, dinner that was held there. But to have the Crown Prince, and had the Miami connections, first with Senator Levy, and then of course later with John Dullaboy, who had been Miami's vice president for development and became the ambassador to Luxembourg many years later. But that's one of those Middletown experiences when I was there on staff I'll never forget.
What I'd like to do is talk about the building where many of these events took place. You mentioned things happened before Finkelman.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the project of constructing that building?
The Dave Finkelman Auditorium that opened in September of 1969 was made possible by a very generous donation by Gladys Finkelman. Her husband Dave was a very active realtor in the area, and his unfortunate passing came about the time that the campus was beginning to open. And you have to bear in mind that when Middletown opened in '66, there was Johnson Hall and Gardner Harvey. The plans for the technology building, which eventually became known as Theskin Hall, were on the drawing board. And they were starting down the path towards developing the design for an auditorium. In fact, they had visited several campuses to look at some possibilities. Mrs. Finkel made a very generous donation, to which she later added some funding, which made possible the Tree of Life sculpture that stands in front of the building. And so the combining of her donation plus some state funding to create the auditorium, because it was going to be a teaching as well as a community facility because of the theater programs. So in September '69 it opens. So in terms of the community utilization, there was a lot of joint utilization of campus community players, which later became the Middletown Lyric Theater. The campus community band, which evolved into the Southwestern Ohio Symphonic Band, as a performance home to the Middletown Symphony. It was the site where the campus provided the facility for that YMCA Travelogue series that ran for so many years. In addition to the campus's performing arts series, the Artisan lecture series that Claire Easton was directing, plus some popular concerts that were held there, such as Aerosmith, the Bar-Kays, and then later it was rented out for dance recitals. Many people, early students at Fenwick High School, graduated from the Dave Finkelman Auditorium. It was a site of graduations. So that auditorium actually provided, of course, later on the fantastic Free Friday, so a lot of younger elementary school, middle school age, and some high school students having their opportunities to experience performing arts there. So that, since it opened in, say, in '69, really has been a center for a connectivity to the community, to the region. Because depending on the artists that you have coming in, you know, if we were bringing in, let's say, a Dizzy Gillespie or a Woody Herman, or if the Middletown Symphony brought in, from one time they had Douglas Fairbanks Jr. narrating the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam as part of their programming. Carmen was able to bring him in. So that drew from a large area.
Carmen's name?
Carmen de Leon, is the conductor of the Middletown Symphony Orchestra. So, but it's seriously even before the opening of the Finkel Auditorium, it was a time that they were using an oversized classroom. It was the same classroom that Dave Bergstrom was teaching zoology in, and so the other large classes, room 113 of Johnston Hall, which then got converted in 1981 into what we call the Commons, which was, they had a pool tables, some vending machines. It had a very, very small service line, a servomation canteen ran. And it had a small stage area at one end. They used to do Blizzard for Bucks or Mentalist Magicians, campus student programming, daytime programming. And then, of course, then that evolved into today's campus community center. But that's really built on the site of where the original performances for the Artisan Lecture Series took place.
So can we continue with the Miriam Knowles Center?
Yes. The Miriam Knowles Center is part of that expansion. In the early part of the 2000s, the goal, looking towards the future, and realizing that there was a limit to what we could help the community do and what we could do programming-wise on the campus. The opportunity came up to combine some state dollars with some local fundraising, in which Dr. Gavinati and Sherry Peratt, who was in the Director of Development, led some very strong campaign for that. As part of actually one of Miami's fundraising campaigns that took place around the 2000 time period. The Knowles Center, the Cohen Gallery, all those named spaces that are in there, to create a space that provided a better food service than a little pass-through window, which is all we had. You could get a hamburger, a hot dog, a grilled cheese. You couldn't have a salad. You couldn't have healthy snacks. There was no variety of those kinds of things. It was limited programming space. There was limited space for the student organizations. There was limited programming space, limited space for student organizations, and there was a lack of meeting space, if you will, for not only for the campus purposes, but for those times when the campus and the community would work on projects together, or the campus would host things. And so that was actually dedicated, the groundbreaking was held, and the dedication took place around the time of our 40th anniversary in 2006. And there was a gala evening where we had, in the main room, we had Phil Dirt and the Dozers doing sort of flashback rock. We had the Back to the Future DeLorean parked there by the door by the bookstore. And in room 142, we had a four pianos. I think we had four pianos performing. So that Phil Dirt and the Dozers would do that for dancing. Then you can go in the next room and you would hear the pianos, and we did that back and forth all night.
That's beautiful. The next thing I'd like to do, you mentioned Director Bennett.
Yes.
Would you please share with us highlights of some of the people who are known to the campus history? Can you tell us what they were like as people?
Let me start with Ray Fenning. Colonel Raymond Fenning, retired United States Marine Corps. I always kidded Ray that you could tell his career by his ties. While he was in the military, traditional tie. When he went into teaching, bow ties. When he retired to teaching, back to traditional ties. Ray, my first office was a typewriting stand in Ray's office. And Ray was old school, conservative, brilliant man. He had led the Model UN program for many, many years. Well known in the community, he and his brothers had helped to develop the area around St. Mary's, now the senior center. It served on many public bodies in the city of Middletown. So whereas Ray was and anything he could do to help a young colleague, he was glad to do, provide some. And in fact, Ray actually gave me a great opportunity because it was a presidential election year in 1984. So he let me lead a 1-hour class about the election. It was a spring class that we did. We brought in different, I got to structure the whole, we must have had 80 to 90 students in that class. Some fascinating debates, let me tell you. But Ray was there to be part of it, but let me take the lead in developing the curriculum and promoting it and developing and doing all that. In the political spectrum, the flip side was Jim Lehman, or A. James Lehman, Arthur James Lehman. Jim was, as I lovingly refer to him, the voice of reason. Jim was a bit of an old school New Dealer. Came to the history profession a bit later in life. I think he had been selling clothing at Hamilton for a long time before he finished his degree. Jim was this, he had the tweed jacket with the elbow patches and sort of that, not quite the Einstein hair, but almost getting there, big bushy eyebrows, and almost that bemused kind of look. But Jim had an interesting balancing effect. They were the best of friends. They were the most diametrically opposed politically. But they're both men engender great admiration, which we still hear echoed to this day from their students. Gene Bennett. Gene was executive director. I met him when I started teaching over there, and then it was he who hired me to my first administrative position. Gene had served in the Navy in World War II. He had been in higher education. He'd been in high schools. He'd been in higher education, did his doctorate at Ohio State, was tapped to become the first executive director hired into Miami. Gene saw the campus through the formative stages when there was still wet cement on the sidewalks, down until his retirement in 1986. In fact, one of the final things that under Gene's watch was the 20th anniversary of the campus. Gene was very genuine, very open, very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very friendly, very gregarious. Great to work with from the faculty perspective. It was respected with the faculty and staff. He had come through the turbulent 70s on the campus. He had come through some times where at one point there was an action taken that they had pulled an issue of Chaos, the student newspaper, which raised quite a furor, I guess would be the best way to put it. But he had to react to according to the directions he was getting from administration. So he came through all that, through the Vietnam time, there's a great period of, as I've read through the history and talked to some people, the question about the role of African Americans, or then recognized as black students, and the blacks in higher education. The first times that Julian Bond visited Miami, first time he came was Freedom Summer Training when he was at the Western College over in Oxford. But he came and spoke in the 70s. Dick Gregory was another person that came in. So there was always that, I always felt that Gene was very good at encouraging the opportunities for people to find that expression, particularly on difficult subjects at difficult times. We went through a period of, there were 2 or 3 times when budgets were cut because of lack of state support. And Gene helped people weather that. And in those days, I don't think anybody lost a position, but services were certainly cut, hours were cut. But Gene helped to steer through all that. There were times when the question of the relationship with Oxford was raised. And what is the relationship of the regional campus to Oxford, a regional campus department to Oxford? How are the faculty interrelated? How do, all these issues are coming up. Let alone that, but you also have the Hamilton versus Middletown, which Miami is unique in that both of the regional campuses are located in the same county, which is a unique relationship that no other higher education institution in Ohio has. And for a while there, it was Hamilton versus Middletown, if you believe it or not, where the Hamilton admissions office, they were out marketing Hamilton campus, Middletown was out marketing Middletown, and never the twain should meet. Of course, that has now come full circle. But so Gene was weathering a lot of that. He had a good colleague in Bernie Phelps, who was the founding director at Hamilton campus, and later with Harriet Taylor, who was the executive director at Hamilton when Gene retired, and when Mike Governati began as executive director at Middletown. The assistant executive director under Gene was Claire Easton. Claire's background, particularly in adult education and through the YMCA system internationally. Claire was the Artisan lecture series. She was continuing education. She was a lot of the administrative tasks that the executive director would, because a lot of things he had to do were off campus, so she was there to handle all the on-campus things. Claire was a very determined, very focused individual. Could be a lot of fun, but also at the same point in time had a very strong focus. And when it came to the arts, she wanted to make sure the success of the arts programming and providing the arts opportunities, not only on the campus, but in the community. Her sense of internationalism led her to be one of the early forces behind Midfest International, working with Virginia Wrighton and with a lot of the volunteers in the community to bring that into being and to link the Midfest to the campus. Claire retired, I think it was in 1987. But the people she had brought in and arranged, and the part of these things that people don't see are the backstage, the planning, the contracting, the scheduling, all those aspects. Sometimes you've got people that have certain requirements. You've got to have this, that, other thing. We got to start with green M&Ms, and sometimes people that have health requirements, housing requirements, but all those types of arrangements that have to be in place, let alone finding the scheduling, finding a routing, finding a fee that was affordable. Because bear in mind, these are the days an adult ticket would cost $5 to the public, and a student ticket was free. So there's not a whole lot of revenue being generated. So for the budget she had to bring in some of these people on some of the roundings, it was phenomenal. The Romeros on guitars, the Tamburitsons, dance troops. It was a challenge that she more than rose to, plus building a lot of programming in the continuing education, not only the avocational things with yoga and health-related types of things, but more vocational things with some professional development opportunities for people in different fields. So she brought all that. She created the Artisan Lecture Series. She created the continuing education programming. I think some of the other cast of characters, as Dr. Governati used to refer to back in those days. Lynn Derbyshire had succeeded Joe Eyre. Joe Eyre had retired as the Director of Student Affairs and was back as a part-time evening counselor when I was there. And of course, Lynn Derbyshire was the Director of Student Affairs and the head of athletics. And Lynn's career at Miami is well documented. The number of people he worked with, both with the teams, with the community organizations, with the student organizations, and the student government on campus for nigh on to 30 years of his career there. On the same day in 1984 when I started, Mary Lou Flynn was the director of admission, and David Sauter was our registrar. David is now back to Miami as the full registrar of the university. But we all three talked with Kid about the fact that we started on the same day. We were sitting in the orientation session, the old room 109, at the same time. Mary Lou had been in the counseling center and became the director of admission. And then Dave had been a graduate student at Miami, had done some work up in Michigan, and then came back to Miami at Middletown campus as a registrar before going on to Xavier University and then Wright State, and ultimately back to Miami, succeeding Ken Bogart as a registrar for Miami. So I feel fortunate I've had those kind of connections. Cheryl Munchenbach-Newton, who was one of the clerical staff in Dave's office, ended up as the assistant to the provost in Oxford. Some of the staff members from that time period, I remember Charlotte Lakes. Charlotte was the admin assistant in the student affairs office, and she was succeeded by Carol Caudill. But between those two ladies, there's such a the students, between the student organizations and the student teams, the coaches would speak nothing but the highest praise for the experience, the level of support that they provided. Not only getting through the university red tape and filing this and copying that, but sometimes the personal advice on how to help out and stepping beyond the requirements of the position to work with people individually, which I think was one of the hallmarks, actually, of the folks I worked with at Middletown. I remember one time it was the last day of classes before Christmas vacation. And literally at 5 minutes of 5, we're locking the doors in the executive suite, and we're starting to walk out the door. And a student is coming in to turn their admission application. And I can't remember who it was, but it was one of the staff from admission, one of the classified staff, literally stopped. I went on, locked the door, we went back in, and we got the student accommodated. I thought, here we are. You could easily say, hey, it's 2 minutes of 5 on the day before Christmas break. We'll see you in January. No, stop. Let's see what we can do to help you. We'll get you processed here. Here's your paperwork. That level of stopping to help somebody. Joe Phillips, who was our librarian for many, many years, the head librarian. Joe is another great example. And Joe brought in John Burke, who's our current head librarian, finding ways to work with students and faculty and staff, and finding new directions for the libraries. As libraries have changed over time, I think in your conversations with Dr. Cavernati, you talked about digitizing the card catalog. Of course, nowadays, with 3D printers and internet searches and online archiving, that evolution over time, going from the traditional book-bound library to libraries in a whole new way of thinking, and Joe started that transition in many, many ways, and John and his staff have continued that.
What I'd like to do, the story about the student on Christmas break eve, could you talk about the sense of family that seems to characterize the MUM campus?
You talked about the sense of family that permeates so much of the Middletown experience. And that's a very good phrase. There's a long time things were referred to as the Miami family. And I know people have felt that over time, as universities have become more business model oriented, some of that family orientation seems to have gone by the wayside. And to an extent, that's true. But at Middletown, I've always been struck, I think we've got a little more cohesive physical plant. We're not as spread out across quite as much ground as, say, Hamilton or definitely Oxford. So you have people working in close proximity with each other, which carries with it its own challenges, but its own opportunities. You've got people such as Juanita Hatton, Carol Caudill, Daphne Eldridge, what was her name? The cashier's office, Blake, was the business office. People who got very active in community service, working with family members. John Hayda was very active with their Relay for Life and cancer. Keep Middletown Beautiful. If a student or a staff or a faculty member ever came to a crisis situation, you could bet the word would go out on the campus and help would be offered. Help would be asked, help would be given. It was challenging on the one hand because it was almost every time you turned around, well, they want this, they want this, they want this, they want this. But if you step back from it a bit, think of it this way, in what other setting do you have people coming together? You figure faculty and staff coming together between 2,500, 3,000 people, not together at once, but milling through in the course of a week, morning classes, evening classes, weekend activities. But yet, there was this reach out. We've got a family that lost everything in a fire. We need the following specific items. We are aware of a situation in downtown Middletown. There is a student in Trenton who just lost her husband. And people willing to step forward or to quietly, behind the scenes, step forward to provide assistance. That sense of helping, I think, was always there. That was my experience. I talked with one of the original faculty members, Mark Plankman. Mark taught French for many, many years. It was when he started the faculty in 1966. And Mark talked about the social events that they used to hold for the faculty and staff. Monte Carlo nights, dinners out, theaters, progressive dinners, and things like that. Finding ways to bring people together. And I think, granted, the 60s, 70s, 80s, everything was a much simpler time compared to the present. The demands on time were not as great, or they were more evenly distributed, shall we say. We were not necessarily caught with the ever-present iPhone, so that you cannot leave home without it, to borrow from the old American Express ad. And we try to maintain that connectivity, and we do it. We send a text message, we send a picture, we post this, we tweet a message. When I started at Middletown, there was no tweeting unless there was a bird outside your window. You want an instant message, you walked down the hall and you delivered it to the person instantly, in person. We didn't have voicemail. We didn't have email until we got into almost 1990, 1991. And even then, it was old mainframe email. You couldn't send a document. You want a document, you put it in campus mail, you waited for the shuttle to deliver it, and then for a little campus mail to finally get it to the right destination. So I think I've had the pleasure, the blessing, if you will, of seeing not only the compression of time and the expectations of turnaround on the downside, balanced by the fact that, I maybe give you a good example. I had a very good colleague, just retired from accounts payable. I have jousted with her on occasion for 20 plus years. Sometimes it was just an honest disagreement about how something was charged, how something was processed. They changed a policy procedure, hadn't thought about how it implicated changes or what could be feasibly done on a regional campus. They had given that some thought. Sometimes she was just plain wrong. Sometimes I was just plain wrong. But I always love the fact that no matter how much, and I shared this with her when she retired this spring, no matter how much we'd be back and forth at each other and arguing accounting, I was a history major, how am I going to argue accounting? At the end of the day, we could always stop and kid with each other. And there was not a phone call that did not end in some form of laughter. I think that's one of the things that made that Miami family connection. Of course, in the old days, everybody lived in the community. So you lived in Middletown, you lived in Oxford, you lived in Hamlin. So it wasn't a case of, okay, I live and I commute this distance, or my schedule is such I work 3 days a week, so I commute in for that and I go back for this. So that you were a presence in the community, not only at the job, on the campus, but in day-to-day life. So if you said to somebody, do you know what Marsh's is doing now? You're not going to believe this. Well, then you lunch, I'll go check, see what Marsh's got going. That's a silly example, but that awareness of what's happening in the community and that level of activity, be it Middletown, Hamilton, or wherever, has increased. I'm working out in Westchester now, Liberty Township. You talk about things going by at a pretty good clip. How do you keep up with that? How do you keep up with people? How do you connect? Middletown, I think, has always had, through its staff, through its faculty, a centering, which has been connectivity. I think we see it when we bring people in for the admission process. And that's not to say that Hamilton doesn't do this or Oxford doesn't do this, but I can speak to the Middletown experience. we bring students in, we start to connect them with each other. We start to connect them with the student leaders of the orientation. We start to connect them with the campus services. We have now University 101 as a course, which is coordinated by Tracy Davis. So University 101 is doing what? It is connecting, further connecting, making a deeper connection of the student to the university. Let's face it, I don't care if the student is 18 or 64 going to school for the first time. They walk in the door, what's there? How do they know it? Our faculty and staff, our student leaders have always been very good to help direct people towards those resources, to help to ensure success. Dr. Gavinati always spoke of accessibility as an open institution, having lower costs than a traditional four-year setting. I think that's a very important legacy that I'm glad to see being continued. And I think the work that's done to connect the students, you can put it in the clinical terms, we'll connect them to the services and the offices, and you're connecting them to the university, and you're connecting them to each other. You're connecting them to the faculty. The faculty are connecting not just in the lab, not just in the lecture section, but you're sitting down and you're having a cup of coffee, and somebody sees you at the table. Say hello, stop, sit down, have a cup of coffee. Got a basketball game going on, man. If I can get a chance, I'm going to get a chance to stop down at the Bennett Rec Center and catch it. Sure. I think that's sense of community is something that's not quantifiable, but essential. It's not the kind of thing you can put into some sort of a metric and measure. And Noah Levitz and the other firms out there will tell me, no, there's a campus engagement survey, which we do every other year, and we compile the national data. We can tell you you can do that, but unless you live it. And our faculty and staff have lived it. Not to say there weren't disagreements. I mean, there were people who wouldn't talk to each other. They'd walk down opposite halls. But when it came time to help the student, when it came time to teach the class, when it came time to provide the service, to coach the team, to welcome the community, they were there.
Now I'd like to know, what is it that you want the readers of the transcript from this interview, the people who will view the video, what is it that you want them to know about MUM?
Miami first started serving in Middletown and Hamilton in September of 1946. It was at that point that they went into the local schools after hours and on weekends to provide, in response largely to the returning veteran population, to provide classes. It started with offering 1 year of classes. By the time these then developed into academic centers, which there were 5, they were offering up to 3 years of classes. The academic centers that grew out were Hamilton, Middletown, Piqua, Dayton, and Norwood in Cincinnati. Of those, Hamilton and Middletown, of course, evolved into the regional campuses of Miami. The Dayton Center was an interesting experience because it was a joint project with The Ohio State University. Actually, I know they love to say The Ohio State. Well, if you read the law, it is The Miami University. So for the sake of equality, The Miami University and The Ohio State shared efforts in the Dayton area in Greene County, with Ohio State offering the graduate level and Miami offering the undergraduate level. That, of course, evolved into what was created on October 1st, 1967, Wright State University, which, curiously enough, is why there are 2 Millett Halls in the state of Ohio. There's a Millett Hall in Oxford, for when John Millett was president, and there was a Millett Hall at Wright State, because at that point he was the chancellor of the Ohio Board of Regents, the first chancellor. So we've got Hamilton, Middletown evolved into regional campuses. Dayton becomes Wright State University in Ohio. Ohio State and Miami turned that over to a newly formed institution there. The Piqua Center was turned over to the Wright State University for operations. And then the Norwood Center that Miami ran was basically phased out as UC came on as a state institution in the late 60s, early 70s, and as the Hamilton campus opened. Jim Rhodes, as governor of Ohio, curiously enough, at his speech at the dedication of Miami University Middletown, September 5th, 1966, gave voice to what everybody has taken to be his policy, that being higher education within 30 miles of every Ohio citizen. And from what we've been able to tell, the first time this has been put forth, we didn't see anything in the Ohio Board of Regents notes or minutes, but as Rhodes' policy, he spoke that in that dedication speech through on Labor Day of '66. The idea of having higher education accessible, physically accessible, within 30 miles. So, and then Miami has been doing outreach for many, many years. Even before the 40s, they were doing teacher outreach when Miami had a teachers college. So they were doing outreach programs for teachers going back into the 20s. But the major push was in the 40s, starting in 46, in the hamlets of Middletown and these outlying areas. And to one point, it continued in Wilmington with graduate programs in education. That continued into the 70s and early 80s. But the Middletown campus, I think, is an example of a regional campus of Miami's efforts. The idea of serving a community, serving a region, more than just one community itself. Middletown campus really became the model that the Ohio Board of Regents required for other communities to establish branch campuses. The combination of the local funding being the key. That was something that Middletown had between, because Armco, of course, donating the land, and then Barnett's Fund coming up almost immediately with $10,000 for design purposes. At the first meeting, without batting an eye, a fellow named Weatherwax was president of Barnett's Bank. They were sitting at a meeting that Logan Johnston had called. Yeah, this is, they were talking about Armco was going to make the land available. And Millett was at the meeting and talked about, well, we want to have, we got to have design, we got to have this, this, and this. And the next thing you know, Weatherwax from Barnett's Bank said, well, we have the Barnett's Fund, and we'll provide $10,000 for planning purposes. So that literally launched things off, but it created a model. Because don't forget, this is also a time when Ohio, for the first time, had passed a state bond issue for the construction of higher education and their public facilities. So this is going to be around the first time that those monies were available. It's also the time of Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. So you have all these elements coming together in almost perfect synchronicity. And that Middletown steps into the part of that early part of that history. I think in many respects, Middletown, later the Hamilton campus, we're unique in Ohio in that it's the only institution that has both branch campuses in the same county, which is a factor of the population, not of bad planning necessarily, but given the population centers and what was being done between the close down of taking the Dayton operations to the north, turning those over to the new Wright State University, taking the Piqua Academic Center that Miami created, turning that over to Wright State, to the south, University of Cincinnati, which had been a private institution, now becoming a state institution at the same time almost the University of Toledo did and Youngstown, again at the leading of Governor James Rhodes. So you've got in the center, and this is before 275 exists. My family moved to Cincinnati in '67. 275 at that point stopped at Colerain Avenue. It didn't go all the way around to Indiana. So it's a different geographic travel landscape that we have now. 75 is still relatively young at that point. So for the Hamilton campus and the Middletown campus to be in the same county, given the population centers in the county, and the fact that there are two commuter campuses versus the four-year residential. The challenge, I always use the example now, we do a lot of classes here at the Voice of America Learning Center for teachers at the graduate level. In the old days, if teachers wanted to take a graduate course, you get done at school 3:30, 4 o'clock. You get in the car, you drive an hour to Oxford. You find parking, that's your second hour. You get to class, you sit through class. You get done, you drive an hour home, you're getting home at 11 o'clock at night. you have to be back in the schoolroom at 7 a.m., 7:30 a.m. Now, you get done with school, you stop over at Grader's, get a milkshake, you come here, your class starts at 4:15, at 6:45 you're done, you're home in time for dinner with the family. It's a whole different dynamic. Again, the accessibility factor, that's a lot of what the Middletown campus created as a model, what the Hamilton campus followed, and other branch campuses in Ohio. That's what the Voice of America Center has done, with the Learning Center being, again, not the full-blown campus, but that amalgamation of the graduate, the undergraduate, the corporate training, the public facility, all in one, 23,000 square feet. Makes for some fascinating scheduling some afternoons, but the end result is the accessibility, plus our location, halfway between Cincinnati and Dayton, the proximity to 75, the proximity to 71, not that far over to the east. So, I beg your pardon?
The VOA campus?
This one, yes.
Okay.
The Voice of America Learning, yeah. Not VOA campus, but be very careful. We are the Voice of America Learning Center.
Okay.
Campus designation is actually by act of the Ohio legislature. There's a formal definition, there's a formal process that has to be gone through. We are a learning center, much as Kent has one in Twinsburg, University Akron has one in Medina, and Ohio University has one in Pickerington. Classroom facilities, essentially. So with the Voice of America Learning Center, coming about largely through the work of the regional campuses. And that was in 1995. Mike Governati, Executive Director at Middletown, Harriet Taylor, then Executive Director at Middletown, and Joe Urell, then the Associate Provost, sat down with the local community authorities. The Voice of America relay station out here in the area they call Bethany was being closed down because they were going to digital broadcasting rather than using the antennas. So at the same time that they're sitting in this meeting with the county, with the township, and with the local school board representatives, learned that they could apply through the U.S. Department of Education for educational purposes. And so we applied for and received. We applied in 1996. We received the deed in 2000 for 20 acres of land located in part of it. It was over 640 acres. It had been the Powell Crosley, who created so much of radio history. Crosley Cars, Crosley everything else, but the Crosley history tied to radio had created the WLW relay station here. So this was part of Crosley Farm that had been pulled together in 1944. So we received the 20 acres here. Our purpose being to be a learning center. So what's happened now is that Miami's MBA program, which had a part-time that was done by sharing classes between Hamilton and Middletown, and it had a full-time residential 14-month program in Oxford. They shelved the 14th month and then brought the part-time program here under a cohort structure that you take classes for 12 weeks, 2 nights a week, you're off, you take classes for 12 weeks, at the end of 2 years, you've completed your MBA. It's a professional, what they call a professional MBA. They're looking for people who've been out in the field working. They are now number 28. This is only 5 or 6 years into offering this degree. They are number 28 in the nation for part-time. And they are the number 1 rated by the U.S. News and World Report in Southwest Ohio. Through the College of Education, we have master's programs, principal licensure, superintendent licensure, reading endorsement. We have a weekend hybrid program for special education masters, TESOL certification for teachers' licenses for teaching English as a second language. We have now begun an EDD program that's taking place here. In the summertime, there is a MAT program for mathematics teachers. The Ohio Writing Center, this summer of 2016, brought the majority of their workshops, including their core course, for their MAT program here, doubled their enrollment compared to going to Oxford. Again, the accessibility to a broader portion of the population, I think has played a very key role. Just as the accessibility to undergraduate education from Middletown and Hamilton in the 60s, and the accessibility to higher education, going back to the origins of those academic centers back in the 40s.
Okay. So just to clarify, the programs you just described are happening here at the VOA.
At the Voice of America Learning Center.
And that comes from the leadership at MUM and at Hamilton.
Because what happened, this center exists largely because of the work that was done primarily by Mike Governati.
Okay.
And Jack Rhodes was then the executive director of the Hamilton campus. But they saw that this was a geographically desirable location halfway between Cincinnati and Dayton. They saw what was happening with the build-out between the two cities. They saw the growth that was in Westchester, what was on the horizon for Liberty Township, what was going on at Austin Landing, north of Middletown. The fact that gradually Cincinnati and Dayton are growing together in this metroplex type of thing. This facility puts us almost at the epicenter of all that. In the immediate community we had, at the same time we were coming in here, you had UC Physicians across the street to the west. UC Hospital, we opened in January of 2009, they opened in March of 2009. And they have expanded twice since then. Now, the Children's Hospital Cincinnati Liberty Campus is located 2 miles just across I-75 to the northwest. We now will have down the end of the street from us across Liberty Way on Cox Road, not only is Christ Hospital putting in a facility, Tri-Health is going to add a facility. So we're becoming sort of the heart of a healthcare corridor. You've got between Westchester and the Mason Deerfield area many international corporate headquarters. You've got Procter & Gamble has major facilities out in this area. Intelligrated, which just got bought. You've got some light manufacturing. You've got some high tech. You've got some pharmaceutical firms, and they're in the area. So all these elements, plus we've got some very strong schools out here too. So I think we're opening up some opportunities for some of the students through the College Credit Plus programs. But with the vision behind the VOA as Miami's next frontier, if you will. But here, in fact, in my office, I have a Swiss flag, which I bought when we first came out here, because we are neutral ground. We are all things Miami. I don't have a logo on my sweater, but simply because, do I put an Oxford logo? Do I put a Middletown logo? Do I put a Hamilton logo? We have undergraduate courses that come from Hamilton, that come from Middletown. We've had even some Oxford undergraduate courses come here. We have graduate courses that come from the Farmer School of Business, from the College of Education, Health and Society, from the College of Arts and Science. And this fall, we're also going to have a class coming in from Spanish, doing outreach to reach Spanish teachers for their master's program. That's a new addition to the schedule. So all these things coming together, this provides the Miami space with the Miami support, with the Miami connections. We've got the wireless, we've got the Wi-Fi. You're tied into the Miami networks, you're tied into the Miami services, into the Miami staff, to Miami faculty. So having that all here, but this all goes back to that meeting in March of '95 that Mike and then Harriet Taylor from the Hamilton campus, and then Mike and Jack Rhodes worked with until, remember it was October of 1999, we sat down in the Board of Trustees room at Rowdebush with then President James Garland and then Provost Ron Crutcher, trying to do we go ahead with this project. And at that point in time, the university made the determination that the responsibility for this place would fall to the regional campuses.
Why have you stayed with us here at MUM?
Why have I stayed? It was interesting when I was a teaching fellow in Oxford. I taught a 100-level history course, Western Civ. And the problems that the students would bring. My fraternity's having to walk out on Friday. Can I take the quiz early? I have a plane ticket home that weekend, so I can't be in class on Tuesday. My sorority is having a fundraiser, and I'm the chairman, so I have to be there, so I can't be in class. I can't take the test. You have to move your file. That was the type of challenge that I was hearing, that I recall from those classes. I got to Middletown, had some large sections of Western Civ. At the ripe old age of, how old was I then, 25, 26? I was probably in the middle of the class age-wise. I had 18-year-olds. I had one student, dearly departed now, Stoyan Trufanovic, had been an engineer with Armco Steel, had retired and decided he wanted to continue taking classes. The questions or the challenges that I ran into in my Western Civ class at Middletown, where I've got a custody hearing at 10 o'clock. Can I come to your 2 o'clock session instead? My child is sick, but I don't have anybody to leave her with. If she sits over there in the corner, is that okay? Because I can't miss class. It was moving from 4-year residential types of situations to real, I don't want to use the term real life, but a broader sense of life in the teaching and the learning experience, in the working experience. Particularly making the switch to administration, I was still tied to that Miami, still am tied to the Miami experience in the working environment. By the same token, I've worked with mayors, I've worked with senators, I've worked with state senators, state representatives, federal representatives, chambers of commerce, people that run food banks, multimillionaires. I mean, it's a whole gamut of people that you have the opportunity to work with, to interact with, which I think is, I had the same thing in Middletown. So it's the day-to-day experience on the campus with the students, with your colleagues. It's the day-to-day experience, which is no 2 days are ever the same. I mean, I can walk in, had a situation 2 days ago, I got a phone call from the township administrator telling me that there was a gas leak on the street just north of us. They hadn't ordered evacuations yet, wanted to let us know, which is great because we had a building full of people. So you go through those kinds of situations, and then to turn around, and I get a phone call saying, we want to have a veterans tribute. Can you assist? Yes, we have an auditorium. We'll be glad to work with you on that. In fact, we are the only ones that do a Veterans Day ceremony between Liberty Township and Westchester Township. It's been Miami since we came out here in 2009 that has done that. And we love continuing to do that. We do it with a broader part of the community now. We work with across an age spectrum. We've got high school students taking college courses here, but we also work with Miami's Institute for Learning and Retirement. So 5 weeks every fall, 5 weeks every spring. We've got classes here primarily for senior citizens. And we help them develop the programming, we provide the facilities, do the work to make sure they have the technology support that they need. This summer of 2016, University of Cincinnati's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute is actually running part of our facilities for a once-a-week summer class for senior citizens. We do a program every December with Get Your Picture with Santa kind of a thing with Miami Books. It's great. We have people that brought their kids every year for 5-6 years to have their picture with that same Santa, and who just happens to be a Miami alumnus, of course. Plus he wears the red and white and does it quite well. We've done children's theater. We have art exhibits here. It's a little bit of everything, but it's always, I think, tied back to what Mike Governati and I'm sure Mike Pratt and others have talked about, that sense of accessibility. Yes, it is part of a higher education system. Yes, it's part of a university and a college system. That need not ever be, and should never be, a barrier. Should never be perceived as such. It is the opportunity to experience, whether it is a children's program, something like the Fantastic Free Fridays at Middletown, one of the performances of the Appalachian Studies program, or something in downtown Hamilton. That accessibility, which in the unique setting of a campus in the midst of a community, literally covers the age gamut. It covers the race gamut. It covers the socioeconomic. You picture any kind of a spectrum, and it really is covered. And I think it's one of the key differences between, I'm not trying to set opposites, Hamilton, Middletown, VOA, and Oxford, but if you think of the intentionality or the circumstance, Miami and Oxford is a community built around the institution. Miami and Hamilton, Middletown, and Westchester is an institution built into a community.